In this video, I'd like to demonstrate the basic setup needed to start rendering with Octane for Houdini. This is going to require a couple nodes in the scene in order for Octane to render properly. So up here I have Octane is installed, and I have the Octane IPR shelf and the Octane shelf. Now we do have a button here that will essentially set up all of the nodes that we need to start rendering with the Octane IPR, but I want to go through these nodes manually. So the first thing we need in our scene is a camera. So I'm going to come up here to the little no cam button in the viewport and add a new camera. We can see that camera's been added, and if I want to move it around while viewing through it, I can just turn on the lock button here, and then if I navigate, I'm positioning my camera. That's not specific to Octane, that's a Houdini function. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. So I now have a camera in the scene, and then what I need to do is I need to create an Octane render target and an Octane render node. So the render target can be added in a shop network. So we can do it in the default shop network here, or I can, in my object network here, I could add a shop network. So Houdini allows us or affords us a lot of ways to create or customize our functionality. So I'm going to go to the shop network, and so I'll add it in here, and I'm going to right click and I will go to Octane and add an Octane render target. And the Octane render target is essentially the node that controls most of our rendering parameters. So we see them over here. We have in the main tab what kernel we're using, so it's set to direct light. So whatever kernel we have set here, we're going to see the tab update right next to it. It says DL kernel, that means direct light kernel. If I switch it to, say, path tracing, now it says the PT kernel. I'll go ahead and set that back to direct lighting. And then we have our parameters for our camera, our imager settings, and then here we have the DL environment. That means direct light environment. So this will also change, this tab will change depending on what environment system I'm using here with Octane. It's set to daylight by default, but I can also choose texture. So I'll set that back to daylight. But you see when I choose texture, it now says text environment. If I set it back to daylight, it now says DL environment. So this will actually add some light to the scene by default. The daylight environment obviously will give us the typical daylight system that we have with Octane. So with the option between the DL environment and the texture environment, we actually don't need to add any other lights to the scene if we don't want to. And then next to that, we have our post-processing and our passes. So that is our render target. And then I also need to add a ROP or render operator node in the out network. So I'm going to come over here to the out network and right click. And I can find this either from the custom category right here, or I can find it from the render category right there. It's the same node, Octane. So I'll add that, and it should be in there somewhere. There it is. And this node controls primarily where we're going to be rendering to. We can also open the IPR from here. So in here's where we can control the frames that we render, whether we render just the current frame or we render a frame range. And under output, the output tab here, I can say output images, and then this is where I set up my path to where I would render out an animation sequence, for instance. So the reason we had to set up a camera and the Octane render target is because you can see here with the Octane ROP node, it is referencing a particular camera. In this case, it's going to reference, if we're doing a full rendering, it's going to reference Cam 1, which is the camera that was created by default. If I'm doing an IPR render, it shows me the camera that it's referencing there. And these can be changed. So we could have multiple cameras in the scene. I could even have different cameras for my render camera and my IPR camera. So this is where we would set up that path to the particular cameras that the Octane ROP is going to use. And then here it's referencing the render target. So if we didn't add that render target to a shop network, then we would get an error when we tried to render. And we can have multiple render targets. We just need to make sure that we tell the render operator here which render target we want to use. But when we add a one and only one render target, you'll see that this name right here automatically defaults to the same name that we have over here in the shop network right there. So that's the basic pieces that I need in order to start rendering with Octane. So if I come up here to the Octane IPR, I can now just hit the IPR button and my rendering's off screen. So let me pull that on. And there I'm rendering with Octane. Now the two objects that I have in the scene, which is just a standard torus and grid, are both pink because I did not add an Octane material to them. And I believe that's something that I'll cover in a separate lesson. So again, this lesson was just designed to show us what are the fundamental nodes that we need in order to get Octane for Houdini set up and rendering properly.